Tonight, our main speaker is John. Help me welcome John to the stage.
Okay, my name is John Bergman, and I am an alcoholic. And first of all, thanks a million, Sarah. You were terrific. Now, people ask me all the time what this is. And there's a foul rumor going around Prescott that this was due to rough sex. I wish I lived up to that applause. You know, it says on page 132 in the big book that we are not a glum lot. So I always like to start off a meeting with a little story. Now, Patrick has a little passing familiarity with it, as a few others may, so I beg their indulgence. But anyway, a guy walks into a bar. He's never been in there before. And he looks up and he sees this huge glass, and it's full of $20 bills. And he says to the bartender, "Hey, what's that about?" The bartender says, "Oh," he says, "we got a running bet in this bar. And anyone who finishes our challenge gets all the money." He said, "Well, what's involved?" And he said, "Well," he says, "look down the end of the bar, and you see that huge German beer stein?" And the guy says, "Yeah." He says, "Well, we take that beer stein and we fill it up half with vodka and half with Tabasco sauce." And he says, "You have to chug it down." The guy's going, "Oh, I don't know about that." And then he says, "Oh, number two, listen real closely. And you're going to hear a dog sort of whining in the background." And the guy says, yeah, I hear it." He says, "Well, that's a German Shepherd. And that German Shepherd has an infected tooth. And you're going to have to reach in and extract that tooth." And the guy's now even less thrilled. And he says, "And one more thing." He says, "In the back room way back there," he says, "there's an 85-year-old lady. And she's never had an orgasm. And you are going to have to satisfy her." And the guy says, "Well, you know what? I think I'll pass on the bet." But he says, "Give me a ball and a beer." That's New York talk for a Boilermaker. So the guy has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, typical alcoholic. And he goes up to the bartender and he says, "Hey, you know what?" He says, "I think I can complete that challenge there." He says, "Here's my $20. The bartender says, "Okay." And he goes down to the German beer stein and he takes a bottle of Tabasco sauce and vodka and he pours them together and he hands it to the guy, and the guy takes his big stein and he goes, and he starts to drink it down. He's spilling it all over himself, but somehow or other he completes it. And he turns around and he says, "What's next?" And he says, "Well, don't forget the dog over there." So the guy goes into this back room and you hear this growling and barking and snarling. But as time goes on, it gets less and less and less. And the guy finally staggers out, and he's a real mess. He's got scratch marks all over his face, and he's got blood, and his clothing is all torn. And he goes up to the bartender and he says, "Okay, now where's that old lady with the bad tooth?" Okay, I figured we have a good audience for that. I'm from New York. We got any other New Yorkers here? Long Island? Where in Long Island? Oyster Bay. I worked in Oyster Bay for almost 20 years. Good drinking town. Canterbury ales, among others. I grew up in Long Island. And when I grew up, I'm old, the drinking age was 18. So that means at about 14 you started to hit the bars. And I was the youngest of a group of guys. And first thing we did was one Saturday night as sort of a rite of initiation, they sent me out to the local beer distributor. And I was supposed to buy a case of beer. And I had no problem convincing the guy who ran the beer distributor that I was 18. And when I first said that at a meeting, somebody said, "Yeah, you're probably bald then too." I wasn't. But at any rate, I bought the case of beer and I'm walking away from it, and there's a county cop watching the whole procedure. And he did not think I was 18. And that was my very first run-in with consequences from buying beer and drinking. So I vowed at that point that, I'm just going to drink very occasionally. It's never going to become a problem. Well, by the time I was 16, I was on a first-name basis with half a dozen bartenders in the town I grew up in. And I knew all the correct way to behave in a bar, how to leave your money on the bar, and, you let your bills get a little soggy and wet, and you have this pile of change, and you never walk out on a free drink. And, I thought I had it made. At this point, socially, we didn't do anything that didn't involve alcohol. Whether we went out on a date, we always brought booze with us. Whether we went to the movies, we'd bring a six-pack or two. We played softball, always had beer around. And, I felt great. I felt that I was involved with the group. I was the youngest, and life was going to be just super. By 18, I was ready to go away to college. Now, I picked a school very carefully. I picked a school that had been written up by Playboy magazine. Now, in case anybody here doesn't know what Playboy is, it was an old magazine with some very serious writing in it. Nobody ever looked at the pictures, but it was considered to be an authority on things like what is the biggest drinking school in the country. And my college won. It's the same college that Dr. Bob went to. It's Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. And I went off to college with three things in mind. I was going to drink and have a great time. I was going to get decent grades, and I was a pretty good student. And I was going to play sports. I succeeded at all three for a while. I noticed right away that none of the freshmen drank the way I did, and I thought there was something wrong with them. The big weekend of the year was Winter Carnival weekend, and everybody brought up dates from their hometown. And I had a date that came up, and I had planned this night months in advance. I'd actually cleaned my room. I put colored light bulbs in the sockets, and I had gone out and bought a bottle of 100 proof Old Crow bourbon. And I figured 100 proof is going to work a little faster than 86 proof. And Saturday night, that was the planned night. That was going to be the night for my conquest of this young lady. So this is back in 1959, and things were a little different in those days than they are here. This was before the days of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and if you wanted something, you really, really, really had to plan it out and work for it. And the only girls I knew were Irish Catholic girls, and boy, there was no action there, I'll tell you. But at any rate, things were going along just according to schedule. And I couldn't wait till it to be about 6 o'clock at night. And except 2 in the afternoon, she got a call that her mother was taken to a hospital on some sort of an emergency basis. And I was the only freshman in this dorm that didn't have a date. I was feeling very, very sorry for myself. And I looked at that bottle of Old Crow and I said, you know what? I'll drink half of it. And by the time I finish that half, I'll be tired, I'll fall asleep, and Sunday will come around and I'll survive the weekend. I did drink half of it. Then I drank the other half. And in a very short order, everybody in the freshman class, and certainly everybody in the dormitory, knew my name. I put on quite a performance, none of which I remember. Sophomore year came the time to pledge fraternities. My fraternity was named Alpha Delta Phi. Now, some of you may have seen the movie Animal House. Animal House was written by one of my fraternity brothers, and I was a member of that fraternity. My senior year, I was the social chairman of that fraternity, which meant I was the guy who had arranged parties, bought the beer, bought the booze. I was a very, very important guy in Alpha Delta Phi. You know, some of you may have heard of Phi Beta Kappa, honorary scholastic fraternity. Well, we also had an honorary drinking fraternity, too, called Kappa Beta Phi, which is Phi Beta Kappa backwards. And I was one of the very first juniors that was ever enrolled to this very august group of people. Well, as I said, I wanted to get good grades, I wanted to play sports, and I wanted to have fun. My freshman year, I was captain of the freshman lacrosse team. And it was a pretty good team. We had 3 All-Americans our senior year. But the lacrosse coach and I did not exactly agree on training tactics. He didn't think a six-pack of beer was an appropriate drink for the night before the big games. And by the time I was a senior, the only way I went to lacrosse games, or any type of game for that matter, was either with beer or a bottle of something. So the very first thing I eliminated from my life, which was important to me, was athletics. So I concentrated on drinking and to some degree on scholastics. As I mentioned, Animal House. This was actually the way our fraternity ran. We had beer on tap 24 hours a day. I had two jobs, actually three jobs my senior year. One of them was I became the Schaefer Beer representative on campus. Now, I knew one of the guys in Schaefer Beer back in New York, and Schaefer Beer in those days was a very big East Coast beer. And this little town of Hanover, New Hampshire, 3,000 college students, became the largest outlet of Schaefer Beer between Boston and Albany. By the time I graduated, people in my fraternity, they're getting job offers, from Madison Avenue advertising agencies, from Merrill Lynch, people like that. I had three job offers. The offers were Schaefer Beer, Ballantine Beer, and I also booked rock and roll bands throughout New England. And that was crazier than any of the drinking groups that I had ever been involved with. So they offered me a job, and I had just enough brain cells left that I knew I wasn't going to take that job. But I gave serious thought to Schaefer and to Ballantine, but in the end I turned them down too. Just about this time, I met a gal who was an absolutely beautiful woman. She was smart, she was funny, she could walk into a room and everybody in that room, male or female, their heads would turn and they would notice her. She loved sex. And she drank exactly the same way I drank, which was morning, noon, or night. 6 a.m., 6 p.m., we didn't care. And boy, talk about an alcoholic dream come true. That was one of them. I lived in great fear that I was going to wake up some Sunday morning, find out that I was married in a motel room. And, that's the kind of existence that we led. But again, this was in the early 1960s now, and everybody had to serve time in the military, and Uncle Sam came knocking on my door, and she became a stewardess for Pan Am. And I'm going to digress here a little bit from my story and just tell a mite bit of hers. She moved from she was actually fired from Pan Am for drinking. And she got married, she married a pilot that she met he was in the Air Force, and she moved back to his hometown, and you're not going to believe the name, but the hometown was Smackover, Arkansas. And they were not used to Irish Catholic girls in Smackover, Arkansas. And that marriage was not a marriage that was made in heaven, and they broke up. And she finally, after about her third or fourth DWI, she was given the choice of either going to prison in Arkansas, which didn't seem too enlightening, or leaving the state and never come back, and she opted to go back to New York. So our paths crossed 2 or 3 times in the future. She married a guy that I knew who was, if anything, was a bigger drunk than any of us, and he died in his mid-30s due to this disease. And she kept on drinking. She never stopped. Her sister asked me one time to go over to her house and see if I could talk to her, and I was in AA by this point. And her name was Stephanie, and she was in a wheelchair. And she told everybody that she had bone cancer. She had lost the use of her legs. She didn't have bone cancer. She had alcoholic neuritis. She was being picked up every single night by a taxi in a wheelchair and taken to the local bar. And she'd spend 2, 3, 4 hours in that bar, and a taxi would come back and take her back to her place. And she was a smoker. And one night after being in the bar, she went back home, and she set the place on fire, and she died. And I went to her funeral. And her funeral had about 6 or 7 people there. It was about as sad a funeral as you could imagine. this is what happens to alcoholics. The only people left at the funeral were myself, maybe one or two of us from the old days, and a couple friends of her sisters. And she and I were so similar in so many ways. We thought exactly the same way. And I just wonder how I ended up where I am and she ended up the way she did, because it's only by the grace of God. Well, at any rate, once I graduated and, I went into the military. Now, I don't know how many people here have exposure to the military, but I'll tell you, there is a lot of drinking in the military. And I'm not going to bore you with war stories, but I will tell you that I got to the point where people did not want to drink with me. I was in the Army because I drank too much. And they weren't used to, so their idea was going out, having a couple beers and running around looking for girls or something. And my idea was to go out and have, 14 beers and, 5 shots of bourbon and what else was available. I got out of the military and got a job and resumed drinking the way I always drank. I used to hang out in a place called the Harbor Inn, which was on a bay on Long Island called Manhasset Bay. Manhasset Bay is the most crowded body of water in the United States. And we used to drink at a place called, it was the Harbor Inn. And one night, we had a bachelor party at the Harbor Inn, and next door to the Harbor Inn was a seaplane base. And the guy that ran the seaplane base was getting married. And we started to drink in the Harbor Inn, and that went on for 3 or 4 hours. And then he got the bright idea, hey, I know a great spot in Connecticut that we can all go to. So Connecticut was about 15 miles away, maybe across Long Island Sound. And I mentioned the bay because this bay had a gazillion boats, it had rocks, it had lobster pots, it had buoys, everything you could imagine. We got into the seaplane, about 6 of us, and with a couple cases of beer, and we started to go out in a taxi lane, and Jim, who was the pilot, wanted to take off. And we grabbed Jim and we said, Jim, you're too drunk to fly this plane, you got a taxi. And he said, I can't taxi this plane across to Connecticut. We taxied across to Connecticut. No, there are no running lights on a plane. I mean, you have lights as you'd find on a boat. You got running lights on the plane, but they're really not going to be visible on the water. Anyway, we taxied all the way across to Connecticut. We got to this bar. They brought out some sort of a rowboat for us, and we all got off the plane and went to the bar, and the people were hysterical. These 6 guys from New York, they came over here, and they're going to drink at our bar. And we spent a couple hours there. And we went through the same thing on the way back. We taxied, and we taxied, and we taxied, and we threw beer cans out. And, somehow or other we made it safely back to New York. And we thought this is the way life was always going to be. Living on the edge, but there'd be some laughs, there'd be some good times. They go pretty quickly. At least they went pretty quickly for me. Every night, I was sitting in this one bar at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I decided, you know what? All my friends are getting married. I need a bit of stability in my life. So what I should do is to get married. So I found a gal that was absolutely naive as far as alcohol goes. Her idea of a big night was maybe 1 glass of wine, maybe 1.5 twice a year. And I would pick her up and I would drop her off at 12 o'clock or something, and then I'd really go out and drink. We got married, and instead of my life becoming a little sane and sober, it went just the opposite way. The first 3 years of that marriage, I spent every night either passed out or blacked out. I drink till I find myself upstairs in my bedroom, not remembering how I got to my bedroom, or finding myself sitting in a chair in front of the television set with the remains of my last drink spilled on my lap. The television always had the Star Spangled Banner going, and that was at about 3 o'clock in the morning. This was my introduction to married life. I prided myself that I didn't miss a day of work. But there came a time where finally I not only missed a day, I missed a week drinking around the clock. Drinking, passing out, waking up, drinking till I passed out. And finally, after about 7 days, I was in pretty bad shape. I was really shaking and baking. I'm like this. And I told my wife, I said, I have to go to the hospital. And there was a hospital about 3 miles from our house. And I remember I got a a 16-ounce can of Schaefer beer, my favorite beer, and we drove to this hospital. And they gave me probably the quickest examination ever known to mankind. I think 30 seconds. They stood arm's length from me. I told them what I had been doing, and the only thing they told me at this hospital was, you can never drink again the rest of your life. And as I was walking out, or trying to walk out, a nurse gave me a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper, she had written down the name of a doctor. And she said, go see this doctor tomorrow morning. I didn't drink that night. I shook the whole night. We lived in an old, what we call a pre-war house, which is pre-World War II. And it had wooden floors and it had plaster walls. And the lighting fixtures in the ceiling of the living room shook. They swayed back and forth because of the shaking that I was doing. Well, I showed up at this doctor's office about 9 o'clock in the morning, and he took one look at me and he says, oh, God, here's another one. He says, come on in. And I started to talk to him and tell him what I was up to. And he said, you know, he said, alcoholics are terrible patients. He says, you have a tendency to die. And he says, we can't do anything for your drinking. He says, all we can do is to patch you up. And he says, I hate to do that because it's just a downhill spiral. I was 27 years old. He told me I was a helpless and hopeless alcoholic. He told me that my liver was enlarged by 50%. And he told me that he wouldn't even treat me unless I agreed to go to Alcoholics Anonymous, because that was the only hope that I had. And I felt so horrible, I told him I would. And the next thing I knew, I was in one of his patients' kitchens about 9:30 in the morning trying to hold down a cup of black coffee. And that was my introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous. I became very, very active. I took a number of different offices in the group. I became group chairman of a couple groups. I did a lot of speaking. I was asked to speak. I took a lot of different commitments, and I never missed a meeting. That is, for the first 5 or 6 years. And then I moved. And I moved about a half hour from my group. And there were plenty of meetings around where I moved, but, they weren't as good as my original group, which was the Manhasset, New York group. And, but, it was such a pain in the neck to go there every time they had a meeting. So instead of going 3 nights a week, I went twice a week, then once a week, and then I started to make very occasional meetings. I'd make either guest appearances or cameo appearances. And the local groups I said I didn't like. But I was sober. I had no desire to drink. It was the furthest thought from my mind, or so I believed. I helped the guy put in a fence on a hot summer day. And the guy disappeared, and he came back a few minutes later, and he had 2 cans of beer. The beer was Coors beer. Now, in the East, in New York, there was no such thing as Coors beer. But I heard guys talk about it when I was in college, and I heard guys talk about it in the military, and they always described it as some sort of a mystical beer. I picked up that can of Coors without even thinking about it and started to drink it. And when I got about halfway through, the first thing that went through my mind was, this is shitty beer. I didn't get drunk that night. And I don't think I got drunk the next night. But that 1 can of Coors beer gave me permission to pick up the next drink. My fragile house of cards, which was my sobriety, was falling down very rapidly. And within a short period of time, I was back to drinking the way I did prior to coming into Alcoholics Anonymous. This is a progressive disease. And I would drink sometimes for 10 days in a row, and then I'd be sober or dry anyway for long periods of time. But if I went to meetings, I'd go into the very back. I came late. I left early. I never put my hand up voluntarily. I never volunteered to do anything. All I was doing was taking up space in AA. Somehow I knew in the back of my mind that I couldn't do this on my own, but I found it really, really, really difficult to go back and make the commitment to AA that I made when I first started coming here. And I told myself, gee, I've been around for many years now. I've been around for almost 15 years. And, I knew what to do. Look at me. I went out and spoke in this place, and I spoke in that place, and I did this, and I did that, and I refused to acknowledge that I was a beginner. I just thought, I just took a little vacation from AA for a while, and here I am. I'm back again, and I'm here to resume my regular spot. It doesn't work. As I said, I picked up periods of sobriety during that point, but I always went back to drinking. And finally, one time, about 8 o'clock in the morning, my daughter had arranged for me to go into a detox on Long Island, and I was in her apartment. And I was a mess. And she looked at me and she said, "Dad," he said, "you need a drink?" And I said, "I really do." And she poured a glass of vodka for me and handed it to me. I drank about half of that glass of vodka, and I looked at it and I said to myself, I don't want to live this way anymore. I can't live this way anymore, and I surrender. And for the first time in my life, I think I surrendered completely. And I went back to AA as an absolute beginner. I was the guy who'd been around for a long time, but I was the guy who was cleaning coffee pots, setting up meeting rooms, cleaning up at the end of meetings. I went back and, after I got some time in, I resumed other activities in AA, took a lot of commitments, and but I always realized how tenuous my sobriety is. We have a one-day reprieve here dependent upon our spiritual condition. I had no spiritual condition when I picked up that can of Coors because I wasn't going to meetings. I will tell you from that moment to this, from when I looked into that glass of vodka to today, and it's over 22 years ago, my life has made a 180-degree turn. I've remarried. My first marriage was really kind of destroyed by alcohol. We never should have been married in the first place. A wonderful woman, but we had nothing in common with each other. I remarried to a gal that I met in our fellowship. And I'll tell you, there's something special when you have two people that are in AA, because there's a understanding that a couple that only one person is in AA and the other isn't just don't have. We have a terrific marriage. We have our ups and downs like everyone else, but I wouldn't trade a moment of it. I have 3 kids, and Karen, who's my wife, has 3 kids. And we're all like one big family. It's like the Brady Bunch. Some of you remember that. And 3 of those kids are in the fellowship right now. And all of them, their lives have changed markedly. One of them needed it desperately. One of them we thought needed it. Not as desperate, but we thought needed it. And one of them was a complete surprise to us. But the change in them, they're all back in the East, so we don't see them on a regular basis, but we see them periodically. I can't describe the change in these people. They're leading happy, productive lives thanks to our fellowship. And I like to think that we played a small portion of it being role models, because between the two of us now, we have well over 50 years of sobriety in AA. But you know what this has given me? It has given me freedom to do what I want. When I was actively drinking, I was either recovering from my last drink, drinking, or planning my next drink. Alcohol was the entire focus of my existence. I had children, I had a wife, I had a business, I had civic responsibilities, I had a lot of things that I was responsible for, and they were all took the back seat to where that next drink was coming from. And that's not freedom, but that's the way I live. But that's what alcohol did for me. It slowly stole the life out of me. It squeezes the juice out of you. AA, what it does is, first of all, it saves your life. Then it starts to give you a new life little by little by little. And I can tell you in my instance, it's a hackneyed phrase, but when I say beyond my wildest dreams, it is beyond my wildest dreams. First of all, I never thought I'd be living in Prescott, Arizona. And don't ask me how I got here, because I'm still not quite sure. But I know I'm in the right place, and I got here sober. And one of the things we checked on before we moved to Prescott was, how's AA in Prescott? Well, AA in Prescott's pretty darn good. It's doing just fine. My wife and I were competition shooters. She's one of the best women in the country. We're shotgun shooters. We shoot trap. And we travel all over the country. I have a big RV, And we go to one of the major events, and we'll have 3 or 4 shotguns in there, 5,000 rounds of ammunition. We're towing a car behind. I'm thinking, here's 2 alcoholics just driving down the road like this. In my active days, I probably would have attempted it. I wouldn't have gotten very far. I don't think I would have gotten as far as Chino Valley. But I have the freedom to do that today. And when we moved to Prescott, people were saying to us, God, you're from New York. You're not going to know anybody. And we said, well, between the shooting community and especially the AA community, said we're going to find a group of friends, and we're going to feel right at home. It won't take us 2 months to get our feet on the ground. And sure enough, we're here about maybe 3 months, and we're walking down by Whiskey Row with a couple of our neighbors. And all these people were saying hi to myself and my wife. Hey, John. Hi, Karen. And they're usually 19-year-olds, with piercings all over and covered with tattoos. And our neighbors have said, how do you know these kids? We didn't want to tell them we know them from the fellowship because we didn't want to break their anonymity. But we just said, well, they're friends of a friend. And this is what Alcoholics Anonymous does. I've traveled all over the world. I've been to meetings almost in every state in this country, and I've been to meetings abroad. And I have yet to walk into a room of Alcoholics Anonymous where I didn't understand everybody in that room. I didn't know everybody in that room personally, but I understood them and they understood me. And this is, again, part of the beauty of Alcoholics Anonymous. Sarah was telling a story before about flying, and it made me remember I was flying one time to Italy. I worked with a group of Italian companies. And about somewhere over the Atlantic, I don't know, near Greenland or someplace. It came over the loudspeaker of the plane. Are there any friends of Bill W. on this plane? And about 3 of us got up, and they said, meet at seat, 16B. And we all walked up there, and turns out there was a gal there who had been sober about 2 weeks, and she was terrified of flying, and she was really shaky, and she wanted to meet some people in a program. We had a mini meeting over the Atlantic Ocean on an airplane. And this is what AA has done for you. I've had people, I was visiting a client of mine one time down in Lubbock, Texas. And he's talking, and he had a funny way of talking, and he finally ended up and said, John, I don't know why I'm talking like this. He says, I'm nothing but an old drunk. And I asked him, are you in the program? And he stopped absolutely short, and he says, what do you know about that? So I told him about my travels in AA. And he said, when are you leaving? And I said, well, I'm supposed to leave tonight. He said, no. He says, you're leaving 2 days from now. And he had his AA group in Lubbock, Texas, throw a barbecue for me. I think they wanted to see what a Yankee drunk looked like. But, this is a group of people that a perfect stranger, they went out of their way for that. And this is what you find anywheres and everywheres in this fellowship. I've been going to meetings for a long time. This is right now my 51st year in Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, it's not all consecutive. As I said, I just celebrated 22 years. But I've still been around for 51 years. And in those 51 years, nobody ever asked me for money. Nobody ever asked me for a job. Nobody ever told me who to vote for. Nobody ever told me what religion to practice. They asked one thing of me and one thing only. And that was to keep coming back. Because I learned that I can't do this on my own. I need each and every one of you. I need all the people that I've met in AA. I need the experience that is just imbued in Alcoholics Anonymous. When I first came in, I had a sponsor who was a really hard-bitten old guy. He was a newspaper reporter for the New York Daily News. He was the I'm trying to think, the name's escaping me for the moment, but he was basically the crime reporter. That was his job. Any big crimes were committed, he was sent out to do it. And the Daily News at that point had a circulation of about 2.5 million. It was the largest paper in the country. And this guy had seen anything and everything. And he had a wooden leg. He lost a leg in the Battle of Iwo Jima. And for you younger folks, that was one of the most vicious battles in all of the Second World War. And he was a cynic. And he went to a meeting in Madison Square Garden, and they were celebrating Bill Wilson's anniversary. And he looked around, and he saw 15,000 people were laughing, were smiling, were happy, they were joyous. And he said, no other time in history, no other place could you find us. But he says, you find us in Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said, from that moment on, he started to believe in miracles. Every one of us here is a miracle. And I hope you keep coming back. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.